high carb diets actually lead to elevated blood sugar or hyperglycemia. And that hyperglycemia leads to hyperinsulinemia or high insulin levels, which then leads to insulin resistance that we know now leads to obesity. Hey, everybody, Dr. Mark Shankman back with you here on the Obesity Project. Today, episode 7, the Carb Conspiracy. So, why cutting carbs is the key to lasting fat loss. So, if we determined at the last video that insulin is the main driver of obesity, then what's the biggest trigger for insulin spikes? And the answer has been right in front of us all along, and that's what you see behind me, or some of what you see behind me, refined carbohydrates. What you can see around me is a whole host of different carbohydrates. Actually, many of these are not refined, but we're going to get into what refining is, what processing is, and how it actually makes carbohydrates even more dangerous. But here's the thing that's most important. Your grandparents knew this all along. They knew that the rise of processed carbohydrate equals the rise of obesity, because your grandparents were saying years ago that you shouldn't be snacking, you shouldn't eat sugary foods, that's going to make you fat. And they knew it. And so now we need to kind of get back to it. So first, I want to discuss the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, whether this is fact or fiction. And so, as we mentioned previously, but we're going to focus much more today on what you're eating in your diet and the components of your diet. We know that high carb diets actually lead to elevated blood sugar or hyperglycemia. And that hyperglycemia leads to hyperinsulinemia or high insulin levels, which then leads to insulin resistance that we know now leads to obesity. So this concept is called the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. And unfortunately, it still does remain controversial. I can't understand how people actually still think this is controversial, but it is. So let's go back to the man who started it all, who shook the medical world with this one simple idea. And the man who sparked the low carb revolution was a Dr. Robert Atkins. Many people have heard of the Atkins diet. So a little history on Dr. Atkins. So Dr. Atkins was a medical physician. Back in 1963, he was a New York City cardiologist, and he was struggling with his own weight. He weighed roughly about 224 pounds. And he remembered through research on low carb diets in his training that there were definitely beneficial effects from a low carb diet, and he tried it himself. And it actually worked like a charm. It worked as promised. And he began to prescribe it to his patients, and the results simply spoke for themselves. He had lots of patients losing weight and making significant strides in cardiovascular health and type 2 diabetes and all this stuff. So at that point, he decided to take it mainstream. In 1965, he appeared on The Tonight Show and promoted a low carb eating diet. And then in 1972, he published his book, the Diet Revolution, which became an instant New York Times bestseller. And at that point, the low carb movement was really born. And so immediately there was a backlash from big medicine. And even though he was a physician, the medical profession really bucked against the low carb movement. And the medical profession continued to promote this flawed theory that we've talked about before, the calories in, calories out method of dieting, and how low fat equals heart health. And that crowd certainly wasn't having any of it, or wasn't hearing any of the low carb business, because they believed that low fat equaled heart health. And the American Medical Association and the American Heart Association both fought back against Dr. Atkins and his low carb movement. But science started proving Dr. Atkins right. And so let's talk a little bit about the science and why low carb diets work. So research backed benefits of low carb diets through most effective ways of creating weight loss, both in the short term and the long term. So studies showed evidence of sustained weight loss as well as short-term weight loss. Now, any diet will work in the short term, but what we see in the calories in, calories out model, and what we see in most diet plans is you lose weight for a short period of time and then it sort of plateaus. But with the low carb diet, we were actually seeing effective means of weight loss both in the short term and the long term. The other thing that was noticed about other diets was that you became very, very hungry on those diets. And the one thing about the low carb diet is they found in studies that it reduced hunger much more than in other types of diets. And then the most important thing, as I mentioned, there was this sort of plateauing effect. Well, this plateauing effect comes from the basal metabolic rate decreasing. So as you hold off on calories, you decrease the amount of calories in, your body says, well, we don't have as much energy coming in as it once had. So I need to adjust the furnaces. I need to adjust the body burning energy and decrease the basal metabolic rate. And that's the ultimate reason why we see so much plateauing on many, many diets. Yet with a low carb diet, it actually preserves basal metabolic rate or BMR, and you see no metabolic slowdown. And that's what really is the big difference with low carb diets. So why do refined carbs lead to overeating? And so refined carbohydrates, let's define that for a moment. A carbohydrate is something like what you see behind me. So let's say you take wheat, for instance. You strip the wheat of its proteins, you strip the wheat of its fiber, you pulverize it into a tiny little powder, and you get flour. So with flour, you've stripped away all of the proteins, all of the fat, all of the fiber, all of the things that slow digestion down, and then you pulverize it into a fine powder that actually then increases the rate of absorption in the stomach, and you get this burst, this big burst of glucose or blood sugar from those refined carbohydrates. So, all the things that are protective, like you see in the oranges and in the apples in the picture, you see that the sugar in those fruits are actually spread out through fiber, and that fiber actually creates a sort of a bloating sensation in the stomach, stretches the stomach out, and signals the slowing of eating and the satiation hormones. Now, our body does have some built-in satiety hormones to prevent overeating. And two of the most famous ones are cholecystokinin and peptide YY. Now, these two satiety hormones respond to both protein and fat, but not carbohydrate. So the cholecystokinin works on the fat system, and the peptide YY, peptide is a short sort of chain of protein. And so the peptide YY responds to the proteins that you eat. So when you eat proteins, the stomach senses that protein and releases peptide YY, so you don't overeat the protein. Same with the fat. The stomach senses the fat, releases cholecystokinin, and you get satiety. You get a feeling of fullness that you don't want to eat anymore. Now, here's the very interesting thing about satiety hormones. There are no satiety hormones specifically geared toward carbs. And then, as I mentioned, when we process the carbs, when we refine the carbs, we're actually stripping away all the stuff that would slow digestion down. You get this massive spike of glucose after eating these types of foods like bread and pasta and rice and all these other things that are cleaned and refined, processed, highly processed. And so the carbs actually bypass these safety or satiety signals, leading to really a full-blown food addiction and really a sugar addiction. And many of us out there have noticed that when you're craving something, you're usually craving something sweet Occasionally you crave something salty, but that may be an electrolyte imbalance. But that sweet craving is because there are no satiety hormones for carbs, and you get this burst of dopamine, which causes this sort of food addiction or this sugar addiction. So let's talk about why you always have room for dessert. So have you ever been to an all-you-can-eat buffet? So you eat at the all-you-can-eat buffet, at 30 minutes, 45 minutes goes by, and you're stuffed. And there's no way you can eat another rib or another piece of prime rib or another slice of pizza. But then, so when you look at those items, when you look at those foods, the same food that you thought was delicious 30 minutes ago now makes you sick to your stomach, now makes you queasy or nauseous, and you can't even think about possibly stuffing down yet another piece. But here's the one big difference, that when dessert is offered, suddenly you have room, you find the room, you have that second stomach that many of us used to talk about when we were kids. So, although you really can't possibly eat another rib, you somehow find room for a cookie or some candy or a small piece of cake, right? You always have room for that small piece of cake. You always find the room for dessert. And that's because the carbs do not trigger the satiety hormones, as I mentioned. So some of the most addictive kinds of foods are bread and pasta, sweets, French fries. But has anyone ever said they're addicted to apples or steak or broccoli? I don't know anyone who ever OD'd on broccoli. It just doesn't happen. So addictive foods are highly processed, refined carbohydrate and nothing else. So let's look at comfort foods too. When people talk about wanting to lean in on the comfort foods, maybe you're super stressful or you've been freezing cold in the middle of winter and you want some warm, comforting food. You want something that's going to make you feel good. You're stressed and you want to relieve that stress. You want to eat something that's comforting. What do you reach for? Do you reach for that steamed broccoli? No, I don't think so. You reach for things like mac and cheese or a bowl of ice cream or a bowl of mashed potatoes or a slice of apple pie, maybe with a la mode, maybe with that ice cream thrown on top. So these foods activate the brain's reward centers without triggering the satiety hormones, as I mentioned. Now, why is it? Because of what I mentioned before, they aren't natural foods. These are highly processed, highly refined sources of carbohydrate that make you feel good, release the dopamine, and they relieve that stress. They make you feel comfortable. But in the end, they're not doing such pleasant things to your body. So what you have to keep in mind is toxicity equals processing. The more that food is processed, the worse it is for your satiety, and the worse it is for your addiction, your sugar addiction. So, have you ever struggled with carb cravings? What foods do you find hardest to give up? Go ahead and drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear about what your carb cravings are. And make sure to tag a friend who still thinks calories are all that matters, because they honestly need to see this, and they need to see the next several videos that I'm going to go into that talk about carbs and insulin and obesity. So thank you so much for watching. Short one this time. Just wanted to talk about the carb addiction, the carb insulin theory, that hypothesis. We're going to prove that a little bit later on in the next video. But thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and comment as always, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.